First of all, there is a case Lacan was talking about in some of his lectures. This case comes from the book that Freud wrote with Joseph Breuer in 1895. So this is like the prehistory of psychoanalysis. It's before he was able to formulate systematically his theories about the unconscious and repression and sexuality. Is previous to that, but we can see it like in an embryonary, in a some of his theories are foreshadowed in this book, Studies on Hysteria. So this is a case that is nice because it's a very clear resolution, right? It's like the riddle is solved in this case, which doesn't always happen in Freud's cases. Freud is actually quite honest when he says this treatment failed. I failed miserably, right? So this case is a nice case in the sense that the symptoms are resolved. The case is the case of Lucy R., who was a Scottish girl, 22 years old, I think, living in Austria. She was working there, being the governess for some children. So I couldn't help but to remember Sound of Music, right? This kind of like the girl who comes from a different culture and is in charge of the education of the children. And by the way, falls in love with the children's father, who is a widow, right? And the symptoms she's having is that she has lost her sense of smell. So when she goes and sees Freud, she has these olfactory hallucinations. She, for example, smells of burnt pudding. And it's not a nice experience, right? It's a very intrusive experience, and it really creates a lot of distress for her to have this hallucination. And she's depressed and lacking energy in general. Now, how does Freud work at this time? Right? Again, in the prehistory of psychoanalysis, he says, okay, this is the symptom. There's this subjective experience of smelling burnt pudding, but there must be something that objectively happened in the past. So this hallucination must originate in some kind of traumatic experience, in which she actually had smelled this burnt pudding, right? So let's look for this original traumatic experience. This is the idea that there was some kind of traumatic experience that was repressed, and now this recurring smell that she's hallucinating is a symbol of something traumatic that happened in the past, right? So you can see that there are some similarities with Freud's later theory about how neurotic symptoms are formed. Something is repressed, and the symptom is a conversion of this repressed trauma, right? That is forgotten. So what do you need to do in this analytic process is to search for this repressed memory. When you find the memory, the meaning of the symptom becomes clear. And at that time, Freud thinks that you need to have some kind of cathartic experience, like you relive this traumatic experience. There is a discharge of energy, and in this way you solve the trauma, and so the symptom disappears. Now, the problem that Freud has is that the way he understood the method at that time, and he shared this with his colleague Breuer, was that you needed to hypnotize the patient. The patient needed to be in a kind of hypnotic trance. And so when he was under hypnosis, the patient would be better able to access this forgotten memory, whatever had happened that involved burnt pudding. Right? So the patient would be able to access this. But the problem is that Freud is really bad at hypnosis. He says, as soon as I tried to practice this art on my own patients, I discovered that my powers at least were subject to severe limits. So he really sucks at hypnotizing people. And at this point, it's a little bit like comedy, the way he narrates this. So he's issuing commands to the patients like, you are going to sleep, and then the patient says, but doctor, I'm not asleep, right? So he says, well, what should I do now? One option is I need to abandon the cathartic method because I'm failing. Then the other option is to go on with the associations, even though the patient is not really asleep. So he says, venturing on the experiment of employing that method without somnambulism. So even though this happens with Lucy R., he's not able to hypnotize her, but he says, okay, doesn't matter. Let's go on. And this is important because this is how Freud develops the method of free association. That doesn't depend on hypnosis, doesn't depend on somnambulism, but still involves, okay, relax, close your eyes, and try to see whatever comes up in your mind. What's your first association? And so he asks Lucy to concentrate and to shut her eyes. And he uses a method that, even though it is not hypnosis, it contains an element of suggestion. What he does is he either puts his hand on Lucy's forehead or makes some pressure with both hands on her head, and he tells her, the moment I release the pressure of my hands, try to capture the memory you have at that very moment. And that will give us like the right clue to get to the lost memory we're searching for. We will get to the traumatic episode this way. So he does this, and the moment he releases the pressure from his hand, he asks her, what have you seen? What has occurred to you? And he assures her, like, whatever crosses your mind at that moment, that will be relevant. That will that will put us on the right path to access the forgotten traumatic objective memory. And he says that this method never failed him. It has always pointed the way which the analysis should take, and has enabled me to carry through every such analysis to an end without the use of somnambulism. So in this way, he's moving away from hypnosis and starting to invent, to develop free association. What is the memory that comes up in Lucy's mind? She remembers one episode in which she was with the children, and then a letter from her mother arrives, and the letter is telling her that she needs to return to Glasgow because her mother is sick, but then this involves quitting her job as governess, right? And she says, well, this was like a conflict for me because I had promised my mom, her mom was related to the person who had died, to the children's father's deceased wife, right? So she actually, the way she says this is, I had promised that I would take their mother's place with them. Stay a second with this literal formulation, right? She's not saying that I would be good at this job, that I would be even like a good mom for the children. I would take their mother's place. Think about everything that is involved in this sentence, right? So this is when Freud starts to think, well, maybe she's in love with the children's father, right? She's thinking about replacing the mother. This memory was not acceptable for the ego of the patient. The translation to English is ego. We need to pay attention to this because we need to be very clear, because there will be a lot of discussion in Lacan about these different terms: the ego, the self, the I, the subject, right? So the German term is ich, which would translate as the I in English. But in English psychoanalysis, the term that is used is the ego. This is unacceptable for her moral consciousness. This is a repressed memory. And so we have this idea of conversion. So the traumatic memory is repressed. When it is repressed, Freud thinks there is a separation between the idea that is repressed and the affect. The affect in Freud includes both the emotional aspect and the desires, even the sexual desires. So this emotional erotic energy that is separated from this idea is displaced to the symptom, right? Is it takes a path towards Freud's terms, somatic innervation. Right? So she starts feeling the smell. Instead of remembering this, she starts feeling the smell of burnt pudding. The basis of repression is the incompatibility between the single idea that is to be repressed and the dominant mass of ideas constituting the ego, the Ich. The repressed idea takes its revenge, however, by becoming pathogenic. So the idea is repressed, but this has a consequence, right? It's good for the ego because this thing that was disrupting the harmony of the ego because it was not compatible with her moral ideals and with other ideas that she had needs to be repressed. For example, the love that she feels for her boss, but then it returns, converted, symbolized through a symptom. Now, the case is not solved yet because when actually this symptom goes away, the hallucination with the burnt pudding, another hallucination takes its place, a smell of cigar. So they repeat the procedure. And she remembers again, they do the pressure on the head, and she remembers another situation in which an accountant was visiting the family, and the accountant was like too affectionate with the children, and he wanted to kiss the children, and the father said, "No way, you are not allowed to kiss the children." He actually shouted at the accountant, right? "Don't kiss the children." And this memory, in turn, takes Lucy to another older memory in which there was a friend, a woman who was a friend of the children's father who had visited them. And this woman actually kissed the children on the mouth. And the father was present and didn't say anything. And when this acquaintance left, then the children's father got very angry with Lucy. He started shouting at her and saying, "This is the last time that this happens. You are in charge of the children. You should not allow this to happen. No one can kiss the children." And the other association that she has is, I was hoping that he was in love with me. And what this moment taught me is that he wasn't, that if he was able to treat me in such a cruel way, with so little empathy, shouting at me, humiliating me, then clearly he was not in love with me. And so this scene had crushed her hopes. And when they work on this scene, so again, they recover their repressed memory, the objective thing that had happened in the theory of trauma that Freud had at that time. Later he changed, but at that time he thought, okay, there was some previous trauma that happened objectively, that had a sexual element in it, and this was repressed. Once we recover this, once we allow these ideas, these representations to re-enter the field of consciousness, then the symptom disappears. It was a sine qua non for the acquisition of hysteria that an incompatibility should develop between the ego, again the ich, and some idea presented to it. Okay, so in Lucy, we have one original trauma that for Freud was this moment when this other woman kissed the children on the mouth. And then two other situations, the situation with the accountant and the situation when she received the letter from her mother. Like the first situations that appear in free association are the most recent one, and you start going back until you get to that, Freud would say, pathogenic nucleus. So there is a core of the trauma, one original situation. Once you are able to recover that situation, then all symptoms disappeared, and actually Lucy was cured, and she was also feeling better, not depressed, and this case was a success for Freud. Why are we talking about it? Because it is an example of the psychoanalytic method starting to emerge, and we are starting to see how free association works, the role of language, how he tries to recover like literal things that were said, literal phrases, and how he starts to reconstruct the history of the trauma, and the role of the analyst and the client in this process. The analyst and the analysand, says Lacan. And now we will try to relate this to what's going on in this class when he's starting to talk about transference. We'll still be with Freud a little bit more. There is another article that Lacan wants to discuss, and he's referring very explicitly. So I want to talk about this article written by Freud before we go to Lacan. So one more step. And this article written by Freud, published in 1912, in the first stage of development of psychoanalysis. But this is already Freud being a recognized figure, already having influence, followers. His theories start to be accepted. And this is one of the technical writings that Lacan's Seminar 1 is about. So in Seminar 1, he centers on Freud's technical writings, and this is one of them. A relatively short article, and Lacan doesn't discuss everything in this article. Lacan will center on something very specific. And this has to do with a discussion with ego psychology that we started last Saturday. You remember that when we were discussing this article published by Margaret Little. Remember about the guy who goes to the radio to talk about a topic that was very interesting for him and also for his analyst. And then he is in a state of stupor, like he's stuck in analysis. And the analyst intervenes by interpreting the transference. The analyst thinks there's something happening in his ego, in his ego's defenses, in relation to the countertransference, to what I feel about him. In this two people game, two persons, two individuals, ego to ego, something is happening in the here and now. And so the analyst, when they are stuck in the process, intervenes by interpreting what's happening there. Actually, you think I'm envious of you, and that's why you're being hostile to me. And this is the interpretation, and Lacan says this is wrong, right? Rather than being, so I will say it in a way that Lacan would not say it, in a very simple way. What is wrong about this? Then rather than being focused on the subject's process, his mourning because of the death of his mother, his own discourse, the analyst is making it about himself, about his own feelings, his own envy. The analyst is allowing to get trapped in this imaginary mirror-like play between him and the analysand. So there is a lot of discussion about whether you should or not interpret the transference, right? When you feel there is something happening in the transference and you are the analyst, you feel that, let's say, the patient is in love with you or hates you, or is envious of you, or feels threatened by you, all these possibilities and many more. Should you interpret this or not? What's the best way to allow the analytic process to continue? What should you do in these cases? So this has a very strong clinical, practical implication. Lacan is saying the way I work is very different from the work my ego psychology colleagues work or the way my American and English colleagues work. This is different, right? So the first way of understanding this difference is that whereas in ego psychology, you tend to think about an alliance between the analyst and especially the analyst as a healthy person, having a good ego, making an alliance with also the healthy part of the patient's ego, right? And working together. So transference would be something good, right? Because if the patient is in transference, he can identify with you, with your nice ego, and you can both work together. This is the ideal version of ego psychology. A little bit cartoonish, but to get, the geist of it, right? So Lacan says, no. Look, go back to Freud. Read what Freud is saying in this article, Dynamics of Transference. He's saying the opposite. He's saying, in analysis, transference emerges as the most powerful resistance, right? This identification between the analysand, the patient, and the analyst, instead of being something good, something that allows us to make a good team and we're working on this together to help you improve, it's the opposite. This is the most powerful resistant. And this is Freud speaking, right? Lacan's point is read Freud. We are rereading Freud. Freud is not saying that. Freud is saying this. If a patient's free associations fail, the stoppage can invariably be removed by an assurance that he's being dominated at the moment by an association which is concerned with the doctor. So let me give you an example. A patient is talking about a symptom, for example, that every time he goes to his job and the boss appears, he's paralyzed and he feels inhibited, and all the things that he knows, he forgets about everything and he cannot make progress. And he starts free associating. And this takes him from one idea to the other, to some experiences in his adolescence, and then to some other experiences in his childhood. And he's approaching a very traumatic memory that is unacceptable for the ego. So at this moment, Freud says, when you're getting close to this pathogenic nucleus, and it's like you can imagine this as a core, as a center, and around it, there are some ideas that are closer to it and some ideas that are a little bit far away. And so you're approaching by association where you're getting close. So the radial distance to this nucleus is diminishing, but the more you approach this core, this nucleus, the more resistance there is. And so at some point, the association stops. The patient is not producing anything else. And Freud says, at that moment, if you ask him, what are you thinking about? It will be something related to the transference, right? He would say, oh, you changed your table. That table was in the other way of the other part of the office. Or he would say, I think you don't want me to continue. Or, oh, I didn't talk about this because maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe you'll think it's irrelevant. So some idea referring to the analyst. So transference appears working hand in hand with resistance. Transference is not helping the analytic process. Actually, it is stopping the analytic process. This is Lacan's point when he's reading Freud. This article, Dynamics of Transference, pretty much extracted, not exactly, but pretty much extracted from Freud. If we follow a pathogenic complex, so what that means, pathogenic complex means genesis, origin, and pathos, the illness, the symptom, right? So if we go to the trauma, the thing that was repressed, this nucleus that we were talking about, right? And we're following it from its representation in the conscious to its root in the unconscious. So you can start with something that is accessible to your consciousness, a dream, a memory, talking about a symptom, and you start by association and you're approaching the pathogenic complex. He says, we shall soon enter a region in which the resistance makes itself felt so clearly that the next association must take account of it. So at some point, the association stop flowing, or there are distorted ideas. You start feeling some resistance. And then there appears a compromise between its demands, so the demands of the resistance, and those of the work of the investigation. So rather than having access to the pathogenic complex, there is a compromise formation. You deviate the topic, it's distorted, and he says, at this point, transference enters on the scene. The transference idea satisfies the resistance. So at this point, again, the client will come up with something that in a way or other relates to the therapist. Again, assumptions about how the therapist thinks or feel, or some detail about his life, but something gets on the way of this free association. But the paradox is this. This is like the center of what Freud is trying to convey, that transference is the obstacle. But at the same time, you cannot do this work without transference. There's no way you can just free associate in front of someone with whom you have no trust, no hope that he will help you, right? this bond between the patient and the analyst needs to be configured, needs to be present for you to make this work. So this is the paradox of transference. It is an obstacle, but without this obstacle, no work can be done. This is where you have to fight your battle against resistance in the sphere of transference. Transference in the analytic treatment appears to us in the first instance as the strongest weapon of the resistance. The intensity and persistence of the transference are an effect and an expression of the resistance. So this is a work that needs to be done. This is a battle that needs to be fought. There's no way to access the nucleus, the core, the traumatic experience, however you want to name it. There's no way to access this without fighting this battle. So transference is both your enemy and your ally. It is your ally because without it, nothing happens. But when it is present, the more present it is, the harder it is to get to these repressed contents. Freud also distinguishes between positive and negative transference, and in turn, positive transference can be divided into two. You have like these, he calls emotional relations of sympathy, friendship, trust, and the like, but this is only one side of the coin of positive transference. When you find this, the other side of the coin is sexual transference. What he says is, well, negative transference, basically hostility or distrust from the patient, makes our work very difficult. Sexual transference also makes the work very difficult. And when you have positive transference, but of this nice kind, emotional relations of sympathy, then you can make some progress. Now, to get to that, again, you need to take into account the negative transference and the sexualized transference and to work with it. And I will keep this as an open question, but there's possibly a difference between Lacan and Freud in the sense that for Freud, you do interpret this negative transference and you do interpret this sexual transference in order to be able to dissolve them to some extent and to go back to the friendly transference and be able to do your work. And for Lacan, this is not clearly the case. I think that it's only in very, very specific situations that you interpret the transference. In general, you don't say anything about the transferential relationship. But Lacan said what? Well, Lacan would say that we as analysts also are subjects. We listen with our unconscious. So what would happen to you is that you would have emotions, right? You would be irritated by something that the patient said, or why did they skip a session, or they are late, or this session was really boring. You would have emotions and disappointments, and you would also project your ideals, right? This is also imaginary phenomenon. Oh, I hope this patient goes in a beautiful relationship, and he was talking about these two ladies. I hope he chooses the second one and not the first one. You identify with the patient. So this will happen to you. But rather than acting immediately on that, on these counter-transferential feelings, rather than doing that, Lacan is proposing that you, because you are a subject, what you do is you go to your own analysis, you work on this, and you try to make interventions that are based on the patient's discourse, that are relevant for the text of the patient's discourse, and that are not a reflection of your ego, of your ideals. So rather, we can again make the comparison with Margaret Little. Instead of just reacting mirror-like towards the patient, you say, I have an unconscious too. I need to work on this. I need to free associate with the patient's free associations, right? And I need to trust this chain of signifiers that the patient is producing, the analyst is producing, and try to find, okay, the metaphors, the discontinuities, right? You operate on this. You would just practice this floating attention when you're just paying attention to discourse. The intervention that you thought was the most brilliant one, the patient didn't pay attention to this. And then they tell you, but I was thinking a lot about the thing you said last session, and you don't even remember what you said last session, right? You don't even have any idea, any clue of what is it, something that you said that appeared random to you had a big impact in the patient. So it's not done from your ego, but from somewhere else. Right. Controlling the phenomena of transference present the psychoanalyst with the greatest difficulties, right? You need to control what's happening. To control, how do you control this? Working on yourself, working on your subjectivity, being in analysis. I remember at some point that I was working with a client and I was talking about this process with my analyst. And he, at some point, the only thing that he said is, but she's not your daughter. This is the only thing that he said, right? And that was like a hammer banging on my head, right? He was listening that the way I was positioning and I was like trying to give advice to this patient in this process, I was putting her in the place of my daughter. And she was not this, right? So if transference is the big obstacle, why is it necessary? Lacan makes a lot of emphasis about how Freud ends this article. And the way that it's like these two sentences in this slide. Transference makes the patient hidden and forgotten impulses immediate and manifest. It is impossible to destroy anyone in absentia or in effigy. What does this mean? This has to do with the paradox of transference. If transference means basically resistance, why do we need it? We need it because only when some kind of strong emotional erotic relationship is established between the analysand and the analyst, the analysand, the patient's unconscious, will play out in the transference, right? So there will be things that he or she says or does or reactions that have to do with the resistance, but this resistance is also coming from the analytic process. So how you defeat an enemy? How do you overcome the resistance? You need the resistance to be played out in analysis. It cannot be defeated in absentia, right? So if transference wasn't there, the enemy wouldn't be there either, right? In effigy means basically in image. So it's not by some kind of remote representation, remote abstract image. It's not if the affects, the emotions, the drives need to be present in the analytic relationship for the unconscious to show up and for the work to be possible. So this is the paradox. Transference is resistance. It's not this healthy, nice association between the good ego of the analyst and the good ego of the patient. It's the unconsciousness we care about. It's the subject with his discourse, his signifiers, his history, his trauma. This is what we care about. But in order for this subject to be present at session, there has to be transference, right? Otherwise, it's just like a bureaucratic thing that where you go and you talk about something and you don't care, right? You need to be involved effectively in this process, which means there will be resistance. But you need this resistance in order to work on what really matters. He reads aloud parts of this article by Freud, criticizing the French translation, and saying we need to pay attention to what Freud is really saying here when he's talking about the dynamics of transference. And he emphasizes this moment in which the client's associations stop and the analyst asks, oh, doubtless you're having some thoughts that relates to me. Right. And for sure, the answer would be, yeah, something in the furniture, the examples we were giving, right? I was thinking that maybe you smoke, whatever, something that involves the therapist, person, right? Personal attributes will appear there. Just when he seems ready to come out with something more authentic, more to the point that he has ever managed to come up with up to then, the subject, in some cases, breaks off and utters a statement which might be the following: I am aware all of a sudden of the fact of your presence. So Lacan makes a little turn here. He's saying the way this is played out is not just that the transference appears and you remember something about the therapist. It's not just that you mention something that has to do with your therapist. At this moment of resistance, what happens in essence is that you were free associating and you were able to be just with yourself in this moment of revelation in which you are free associating and finding something that has to do with your truth, with your history. And then when you stop, it's because you acknowledge, you are aware that there's someone else there. You become aware of the therapist's presence. Just that is enough to create a moment of resistance. You become aware that there is an other there listening to you. He tries to, I think, to give it a more philosophical side, I would say even metaphysical side, right? So he says there, we'll go back to this next Saturday, but he says that there are two ways of using language. We can use language for communication, for expressing ourselves. Language is good at mediating between two people. We have a message and we want this message to reach the other person. And for that, we use language, right? This is the whole theory of the communication. You have a message, the channel, the person who emits the message, the person who receives the message to another. And you're expressing yourself when you're doing this. But he says there is also another use of language, which doesn't have to do with communication, doesn't have to do with expression, and this language as revelation. So this is why I'm saying this is philosophical, because this is a little bit like Heideggerian language disclosing your authentic being, right? And so when you are free associating, you are not expressing anything, not trying to communicate. You are just allowing your inner being to reveal, to be disclosed, to appear. And so this is a moment of authenticity. And your language is full of meaning at this moment. And then you realize, there is another there. There is a presence, the other as an object, even something that is out there. And so you stop your language as revelation and you go back to communication mode, right? This empty speech that we have with other people. How was your day? Are you okay? Right? The way I started today, autumn is coming here. Empty speech, elevator speech. I think you can think it more than like a binary opposition, more like a range, right? So sometimes we go more to the pole of revelation and free association and don't caring about making sense to the other. And sometimes we go to the other extreme of just making sense and communicating clearly, and sometimes, chit-chatting, superficial, shallow speech. That's a very good point. So when you are doing Freudian or Lacanian psychoanalysis, you are not looking at the other's face, because you are trying actually to not be in that space of mirror like, right, guiding yourself by these little clues, gestures. Does he like what I'm saying? Is he irritated? You go back to that dynamic, imaginary dynamic, right? I mean, you can be a psychoanalyst, a Lacanian psychoanalyst, and still work face to face. It's okay. But the reason why the device, let's say this configuration is like this, is exactly to mark this asymmetry, right? We're not just two people chatting, interested in each other. I'm listening to you, I'm listening to your speech, and what I really desire is that you can free associate and produce your own revelation in this process. Freud uses the term countertransference. I think Lacan doesn't like it very much, because what he would say is there is just transference in the same way as there is just the unconscious. So what transference means is, because we are in this kind of very strange situation, right? I'm here to talk about myself and to free associate, and this person knows something, but I don't know what. This person knows exactly that he will be able to help me heal. Like, in this strange setting, this creates all kinds of contribution. I'm not even looking at this person's face, and I'm speaking, and this person maybe is becoming my father, or my brother, or or even an imaginary being. And so, but the same thing is happening to the analyst to some extent. So there is transference, these emotions and desires that the analysand has towards the analyst, and sometimes they involve like displacements or these quote unquote confusions, right? Or identifications, projections. All this is happening. And of course, the analyst has its own identifications and projections, but both of them are subjects. and both of them have an unconscious, and both of them need to work on this. When it's the patient's session, it's his time or her time to work on this. But the analyst, to make sure that he's working to make the analytic process move forward. If he speaks just from countertransference, if he just takes his clues from what am I feeling in this moment, or the patient is hostile, I feel this hostility and I don't identify with him, and it must be because of this. And so my ego comes up with a reason why this patient is jealous of me, and I interpret that. I am not facilitating the analytic process. I'm actually working for the resistance there. Right? It's my own resistance that is interfering with the client's process. Now, if after the session, I go to my own analysis and I said, I felt really uncomfortable during the last session with this patient. Okay, what happened? And I start free associating with this and I work on my process, on my unconscious, then I will be able to better listen to this patient. So I think that it is nice in this text that Lacan does all these things at the same time. There are philosophical references, rereading of Freud, but also very concrete clinical implications for how we can work.